Hello and welcome to another episode of Sports Greatest Rivals. This week we are doing a behemoth between two of the world's biggest rugby nations, South Africa and New Zealand. Today we have again got Joe. Joe is going to be covering New Zealand for us, and we have got Elliot coming in. Sorry, he's covering New Zealand, and Joe is covering South Africa. So we've got this kind of big, massive rivalry. England would like to consider themselves the biggest rugby nation in the world, but these two outstrip them. So, Joe, we'll start with you. What is your knowledge of these two nations and the rugby rivalry between them as a whole? And nice to see you. Hope you're well.
Nice to see you too. It's interesting because like you say, England like to think of themselves as one of the juggernauts of rugby, and to an extent they are. But I don't know. I just had it. There's a mystique around South Africa versus New Zealand. It is one of rugby's biggest games, like two powerhouses going head to head so frequently as well. It does have a layer of legend to it, and I think that's what's one of the most interesting things for me.
And what was your kind of personal experience with it in terms of did you know much about it before you got into rugby yourself?
Sort of. So like m- being into rugby, you're always aware of the All Blacks. Like they are like the early 2000s Manchester United, or I guess a better example is Brazil, like the 60s Brazil of rugby. They are the team that everybody knows. Everybody knows the haka. Everybody knows the famous uniforms. It's they're just really cool. And that's one of the things that's so great about them. South Africa, on the other hand, I didn't know a lot about until I started watching rugby properly, and
Hmm.
then you're like, oh, right, these they love rugby in South Africa. And I had a Springboks jersey that I would wear to training nearly every week.
I remember
Um,
that.
it was a great jersey.
Yeah, I remember that jersey.
But yeah, so it from then on, and then obviously the film with Nelson Mandela and Francis Pienaar um being played by oh, I can't remember his name now.
Matt Damon.
No, yeah, Matt Damon. So that kind of, further pushes the narrative of the two nations. And I think that World Cup is also a really interesting point. I was a little bit upset have it being given South Africa, considering
Uh,
England's relationship to them, but
That was a deliberate move by me. When Brendan said, "Do you want to do this podcast?" I was like, "I'll only do it if I can be in New Zealand. I don't want to come on and talk about South Africa after what's happened in 2007, 2019, and 2023." So,
But yeah, I'm a big Safa now, big Bomb Squad fan. But yeah.
so, so Elliot, we've heard Joe's experience of it, and he obviously talked about the mystique. What was your experience of South Africa, New Zealand been since you got into rugby yourself, and even then before that?
Yeah, yeah. So I started playing rugby quite young. Me and Joe both started playing quite young. We played around the age of like 6 and 7, I think we
Mm.
started, which is 2004, 2005. Very much a case of like post World Cup England win fever. I think rugby became a bit of an it sport for a couple of years and then faded away. Me and Joe used to go to games together. We're cousins. Put this in context. So we used to go to the Sale Sharks games down at Edgeley Park when they used to play in Stockport. I carried on playing throughout my teens, and I didn't take much of an interest in like televised rugby until the 2007 Rugby World Cup. Because before then, I kind of most of my experience was through playing it or through watching Sale Sharks. So
Rugby
then
'07 as well.
Rugby '08, I've got. I
Rugby
don't
was
know
it?
what
Quality video
Rugby
game.
'08. I can't remember what it was, but that's on my notes. I've got my notes here, and it says the history of New Zealand growing up. I was like, this is something that I know will get a smile out of Joe, and it was all about my big memory growing up was playing as New Zealand against South Africa on Rugby '08 on the PlayStation 2, and that
Yeah.
was yeah. It was a legendary rugby game. Still not to be topped. There's no rugby video game
No,
that's been anywhere near as good since that game.
the
And I
Journal Omu
remember,
series wasn't great.
yeah, no, I remember Richie McCaw, um, Dan Carter,
Mm.
Joe Rocco Cocco, who used to play on the wing. They were unstoppable in
Yeah.
real life and on that video game. So that was a lot of a lot of my experience growing up was playing that game. And then like Joe was saying, there was a it was a glamour tie. It was the glamour tie, I think, of rugby, like an El Clasico kind of thing. That New Zealand versus South Africa was like the big one. They were the big two
Mm.
sides, the two nations that I think clearly have rugby as their first sport. Like England, obviously, we have football. France, kind of half football, half rugby, depending on where you come from. But rugby is the sport in New Zealand and South Africa, and that adds to the excitement of those two sides clashing.
Yeah. And look, for myself, like I'll be honest, I like yous played that rugby away game. I loved it to bits. I think it was the first game Ireland were actually decent.
Yeah,
Um, but the thing was, like, I remember, like you, Elliot, I remember sat there, like, big into the 2007 World Cup of Ireland, being like, Ireland are favourites to win it. Got knocked out
yeah,
in the pool stage.
yeah,
Nice. So
yeah.
then it
Bottling
was
it as always.
always, and then it was the as long as England don't win, I'll be happy. And watching you
Mm.
get beaten that final brought a new love for South Africa for me. Who I didn't
Mm,
personally, I didn't think they were anything special at the time growing up. But as Joe said, you always go and you hear All Blacks, New Zealand, you think, God, these ones are
yeah,
something above everything
Mm.
else. But haven't looked and haven't studied, and haven't come into rugby more, my perspective has changed a lot more,
yeah.
Mm.
and we'll discuss that throughout. But look, that's enough from us three personally. Elliot, we're going to kick off with you with New
Mm.
Zealand in terms of, I believe they were the older of the two in terms of rugby nations.
Yeah, so New Zealand are the first recorded international rugby side. They started out in 1884, I've got, with a tour of Australia. Some
Hmm.
places say 1903 was the first proper test match. So they were maybe like exhibition games back in those days. Test match rugby started in 1903. New Zealand have the most Rugby World Cup final appearances. They have 5 appearances, which
Right.
beats out South Africa's 4. However, South Africa have won all 4 of their finals appearances, which I'm sure Joe's going to say about. Whereas New Zealand have won it 3 times and come runner up twice, both times to South Africa.
Yeah.
So yeah, they've made the most finals, but not won it the most times, which is something I'm sure we'll touch upon and has angered New Zealanders over
Hmm.
there. So yeah, they've got a good history in the Rugby World Cup, but then they've really dominated the Tri Nations tournament, which I know is kind of like the lesser of the competitions. You think about, like, say we put it into football perspective, like winning the World Cup versus winning not even like a Euros, it's more like a Nations League kind of
African
tournament
Cup of
where
Nations.
yeah, it's a lower tier. It's not, yeah, 'cause it's between a very small group of nations. So how can you prove to be the best outside of the World Cup in rugby? And I know it's the 3 big ones. It was South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, and then they've added Argentina into the mix now. But New Zealand have won that a whopping 20 times
Yeah.
since the competitions was brought in. So yeah, 20 times. So that stretches throughout the 90s, the early 2000s, and the 2010s, and then recently. Um, Overall in history, the All Blacks have played test matches against 19 different teams, and 12 of them have never won a game against them. They have a 77% winning record in test match rugby, and they
Hmm.
don't have a negative record against any side they've ever played a test against. That includes South Africa. So overall, I think New Zealand have the better of South Africa there.
Certainly do.
Yeah, and then since the introductions of the world rankings in 2003, New Zealand have held the number 1 ranking longer than all other teams combined. So that says
Just
a
give it
lot about why they,
Wow.
yeah,
just
Joe
give it
have,
20 years. Ireland will be there. It's fine.
yeah,
That's
maybe
incredible, though. That's really,
it's
really
it's
interesting.
crazy. It's so easy to see now, like you said before, Joe, why they're seen as that kind of Real Madrid, LA
Mm,
Lakers of the rugby world because they
mm,
have that legacy um, that comes from success. Like you think of the All Blacks and you think of the all black jersey and then the gold trophy on the sleeve, and that comes from all those competitions that they've
Well,
won throughout
Elliot,
history.
do you think that kind of the kind of success they have now in the modern era comes from the success they had in the amateur era? Because in like 1924, there's newspaper clippings calling them the Invincibles, where they go to Europe, play against England, Scotland, Ireland, and France. Like Ireland didn't beat them until the 2010s
Mm.
In Chicago of all places. It took them until then to beat them. Like that invincibility against every nation. Do you think that helped create this mythos around them?
Yeah, there's definitely. I use the word aura around them, the All Blacks. Like when a sports team has a nickname, it's quite a big thing. So yeah, they were so good in the amateur era, and that kind of the investment that New Zealand as a country put into rugby early doors is why they've been so successful. And we'll talk about this later, but other nations are catching up now. But
Mm.
that's why they got off to that really hot start. And then obviously a lot of fans' eyes were open. I can't talk about New Zealand without talking about Jonah Lomu. I've got to
Mm.
mention him. He's got to get a little brief mention. The late great Jonah Lomu, absolute beast of a man, freakish athlete, unbelievable player. He had like the speed of an Olympic sprinter, the strength of like an NFL linebacker, and the footwork of like incredible footballer. And I think obviously you have that picture in your head of what the ideal rugby player looks like, and you think of Jonah Loman, six
Mm.
foot five, freak athlete, and yeah, that he was one that obviously I think for a lot of our generation is talked about in that kind of godlike status
Mm.
that helps create that aura that we've been speaking about around New Zealand.
It's so interesting though, because like him as a personality could have been like the if you put into context like the marketing people receive now in sports could have
Yeah,
been like on the
yeah,
level of I mean I can't really think like Johnny Wilkinson is the only
yeah,
player I think that has breached rugby into the popular
yeah,
cultural zeitgeist. He could have
The
been on that
only
level.
the only one I can see doing that now in the future will be Antoine Dupont.
yeah,
Yeah.
Dupont, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's trying to do that because he's obviously done that. He's made that move to play in bits
Mm.
of league, and then he's playing in the sevens. So
Mm.
he's becoming that marketable, the face of rugby. But I still think amongst people, Jonah Lomu will always be the face of rugby.
Yeah.
And yeah, that adds to the hype around New Zealand.
Oh yeah, 100%. And look, in regards to what you were saying and everything that you said, like, and I was asking about the kind of history of them, and with New Zealand, like, it's a really successful history, but we'll talk about it later. But when was the first Test series that New Zealand ever beat South Africa in? It didn't happen until 1956,
Yeah,
even though their first game was in the 20s.
yeah, yeah,
It, like we'll talk about it again. It just seems that South Africa are the little nation that seems to stick with New Zealand in terms of being their annoying wee brother.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
They definitely get under the skin a little bit. It's a bit of a bogey team.
Mm.
mhm. Well, that's
They've
the whole
been
point of
so
the rivalry.
Yeah, they've been so dominant over everyone. And then yeah, South Africa has been the real sticking point that can still the country that says, well, actually, we've won more World Cups.
Well, it's going. Well, we'll talk about it when it comes to the rivalry because I'm going to talk about the World Cups
Mm.
and all that. But look, Elliot, thank you for that. I'm going to talk to Joe now in terms of Joe. You were given the task by Elliot because he doesn't like South Africa because of the hurt he faced. Can you enlighten us on South Africa, please?
Yes. So, I found this really interesting because obviously the first international test with in South from South Africa was against what is now the British and Irish Lions in
Hmm.
1891. But through a little bit of digging, before that, in I think about 30 years earlier, they played a local game between they named it like Colonials versus Home Nation.
Good old British Empire.
Good old South
Yeah,
Africa and Brit, yeah. So it was basically a game that would they would play this continuously, and that was kind of the birth of a rugby side. But then when they took it to the international stage, they did get beat. They got hammered at first by the British and Irish Lions, but then slowly but surely the game began to become more popular, and they continued to grow the game. And I think within a short space of time, they managed to come back and beat the touring nation of the British and Irish Lions quite handedly. Um, it's always been a bit of a strange one for South Africa because of the apartheid. You can't talk
Yeah.
about South African sport without mentioning the apartheid.
Mm.
And I think in a lot of ways, and a lot of reasons why this rivalry exists is because of that. Black South Africans support the All Blacks and have
Yeah.
done for a long time. Um, and I think part of that is because rugby was seen as a white man's sport for so long in South Africa. Um, the the changing point for me in that was the World Cup in 1995, and that was when it really sort of became the sport of everybody. Rather,
Yeah.
we all joked about the Rainbow Nation and stuff like that, but that's when it became everybody's sport. Um, and during a tour in 1992, um, they actually did beat this. Sorry, they got beat by New Zealand prior to the World Cup, and I think that was one of the first games they played before the World Cup.
Yes. Yeah. Because they were
Was
banned.
against
They're
yes,
banned for a
yeah,
while.
yeah, they were. So yeah, that kind of the history of it is it for me. It doesn't really become South Africa until that point. It's an interesting sort of way because looking through the history, all of a sudden the flag changes, and it wouldn't be right for me to say it was South Africa without mentioning the apartheid and how it changed and how it then became a sport for everybody.
Well, Joe, having again done my own research in terms of the apartheid legacy seemed to continue
Mm,
even into the 2000s
mm,
because one of the coaches in the so we both know South Africa have had kind of highs and lows of the professional
mm.
era. 2007 was a massive high after years of low in the early 2000s. Um, and
Rub
this,
that
I'm
one
not,
into the wound. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
pardon?
Cheers, man.
Rubbing that one
Yeah.
into the wound. Yeah, yeah. Rubbing salt
But
there. Yeah.
what I'm trying to get at is in the early 2000s they started really well, and then
Mm,
2004, 2005 started to slip. 2006, no one
mm,
expected them to win in 2007, especially when their coach at the time, Jake White, came out
mm,
and spoke about how the team can't perform because of transformation. An actual quote
mm,
from him,
mm,
which was a reference to the government's policies to readdress racial imbalances in the sport. So the fact that he was apparently blaming the fact that he had to play black players in the team.
yes. Yeah, I can't remember if it's still a rule, but I know for a while there was a rule of South African teams for rugby, cricket, football,
Hmm.
whatever. They had to have a certain amount of black and white players,
Yeah.
um, which I find really, really interesting because, like, if you look at the colonial sort of view of sport, it's that we have this notion that black players are more athletic or they're faster, they're stronger. So I find it really interesting for him to say that.
I personally think it was just they were playing poorly. He's looking for an excuse.
Mm,
Um, but as I say, it still holds on from your point of apartheid of
mm,
even though in 1985, one nation, one team,
mm,
one country, that was the message that was portrayed as they won it.
mm,
It's never truly, and even now today, having interviewed a few South Africans, um, in terms of players,
mm.
like they realize that rugby unites the whole nation together
Yeah,
through the struggles they still have.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and
It's really interesting because I remember when we went and watched them play Ireland, um, immediately in the aftermath of that, all of the blame was on um what's the second rower's name? The black lad, the
Khaleesi.
captain. Yeah, all the blame was on him and on the 10 as well, who was black as well. And then they changed those players midway through a game as well. And it's like, I don't know, it's almost like they continue to be the fall person or the person that they're looking to blame. So it is a checkered history of the South African rugby team, definitely.
Well, that's my and then now moving to a positive note, South Africa are the best team in the world now, and
Yes.
I think that's undeniable. I know they lost last night to Argentina,
Mm.
and
Good
last
game
month
though. Like the RGs did well.
they did. Also should have won, but Liebach,
Mm.
who with the number 10, he missed the kick in the final minute.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, but yeah, no, in my view, they are the best team in the world. They've got the most powerful forwards, some of
Mm.
the best backs, and they've
Mm.
got the best tactics.
Mm.
That I feel personally, are to go in that way. But look, we move on to the rivalry, and I'll bring Elliot back in. So Elliot, we have the
Mm,
rivalry. Rivalry kind of kicked off in 1921 when
mhm,
New Zealand toured South Africa. Now, in terms of the rivalry as itself, it's always been massive. It's always been a kind of struggle between initially two colonial powers,
mhm,
in terms of two colonies, sorry, um, looking to maybe make a name for themselves in the world of sport. Like,
mhm.
and as Joe mentioned, it became a bit difficult because of the politics around it. But just going back in terms of the rivalry as itself, can you enlighten us a wee bit in terms of the early rivalry, maybe taking it up to the present?
Yeah. Well, as we've alluded to, I think it's steeped in history and civil rights. Has been very much the heart of the rivalry. There's been, they toured each other's nations several years on the bounce. So South Africa would go over to New Zealand, New Zealand would go over to South Africa. There was a lot of kind of, as you were saying, they were trying to make a name for themselves as two countries in a sport that was maybe not as popular in other countries as it was there. So they saw a real opportunity to get that as their kind of, you know, as a power for
Mm.
good. But New Zealand, it goes back to a tour. I can't remember what year it was. I'll have to jog my memory. But there was a tour at the time. There was a controversial call where New Zealand took Maori players over to South Africa with them. South Africa, it was during their apartheid system, and they weren't best pleased about that. There was a controversial call at the time. New Zealand then backtracked on that the next tour and chose not to take any Maori players, which sparked revolt amongst New Zealanders, who I think at that time, especially because of rugby and the way it was, I think New Zealanders were always quite proud of the Maori culture and things like that. I think they were quite a proud nation. There wasn't as divisive as it was in South Africa. So a lot of New Zealanders, both black and white, from the Maori community and outside the Maori community, protested New Zealand's choice, or the New Zealand Rugby Union's choice not to take any Maori players on tour. There was several movements that took place. The No Maoris No Tour movement in 1960, and a similar protest in 1970, the HART, which stood for the Halt All Racist Tours Group. Um, so they took place in the 60s and 70s, but ultimately they unfortunately they failed in that attempt. New Zealand still chose to go on those tours and not take any Maori
Well,
players with them. So
I was going to say, Elliot, like these movements, and like it took FIFA to ban South Africa from all sport that
yeah,
way, and we've seen that's really affected them soccer wise. It took the
Mm.
Olympics banned them as well, or sorry, the Olympics didn't ban them, but nations refused to compete because
yeah,
South
to
Africa
compete
were
against them.
competing.
Yeah,
The fact that New Zealand, even though they were like, "Oh, this is all bad," and fans were against apartheid, still send the team. Did these
yeah.
protests actually send a message? Really, if they're being ignored?
No, not really. I think that gets down to the bottom of it. It didn't, and that kind of makes the results in this period almost irrelevant
Mm.
because what are South Africa without black players? What are New Zealand without Maori players? Like they are both such significant parts of their culture and their history that this era is really kind of, I try not to look into the results too much or take any weight in the results of that era because they're irrelevant as far as as far as my
Mm.
opinion goes, because it's something that shouldn't have been happening even at that time, and yeah, it's
Do you
reflects badly on both nations.
do you think that that maybe brought the rivalry more to a head? Because I was looking in 1932, New Zealand toured at the exact same time. They toured Australia and South Africa. They had a collection of white players go to South Africa because the Maori players were banned. And
Hmm.
in protest, they refused to do the haka, which
Yeah,
it's a big protest that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, while the Maori players and the reserve white players went to Australia.
Mm.
Hmm.
No, they lost both, maybe because their team was depleted on both sides.
Yeah.
Um, do you think that like that hate that what you could call hatred? Do you think that
Mm.
hatred towards another race of players really brought the rivalry up to boiling point?
Definitely. I think it shows kind of now in the fixtures that are going on that I think the Maori players that play for New Zealand in the current squad and the black players that play for South Africa in their current squad, it almost means more to them when they have these games because of that history. They want to prove themselves and kind of fight for their ancestors and the people that came before them that maybe didn't have the chances that they had, didn't have the equal opportunity that they have now. So it's really obvious, I think, when you see Khaleesi and for South
Mm.
Africa, he wears his heart on his sleeve. And it's very similar for the Maori players that are in the current New Zealand setup, that they're very much proud to be kind of representing their nation, but also representing their people and where they've come from, and that they've had to fight for
So, Joe,
generations.
in regards to obviously the World Cup victories, now Elliot mentioned a lot earlier, a long time earlier, from the conversation about the success of the two teams in the World Cup. Two most
Mm.
successful World Cup teams, seven wins between them, three for New Zealand and four for South Africa. But the first World Cup was held in what, 1987?
Mm.
Yeah, and
Yes.
the original winners were New Zealand. But can you enlighten us of why maybe South Africa might be like, it would be a different story if history was a bit different.
So because of the isolation during the apartheid, the South African team were actually banned from competing in the first two Rugby World Cups.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of South Africans would say, actually, we probably would have won those if we were in them, um, because they were playing some very good rugby at the time. Um, they, I think they toured. I think they toured New Zealand and won before the World Cup happened a couple years. So I think they felt that perhaps we could have replicated that form and beaten New Zealand and Australia at the time as one of the three big Southern Hemisphere nations.
Well, they were banned from 1985 to 1991,
Mm.
so they might not have obviously been playing some quality rugby because they weren't allowed to against other big nations, but they're playing collections of teams like you'd have
Yeah,
Scotland.
they were still playing, and I think a lot of those players, well, South Africans would argue that a lot of those players would have been in the World Cup team, and that's why
Hmm.
they felt they were a strong team.
Yeah, and I know. Obviously, Elliot, you can maybe enlighten us
Mm.
this way of how South Africa have never lost a World Cup final.
Yeah, sadly, yeah. If we go back to 2007 and 2019, yeah, we wish that it would have turned out differently
Mm.
as Englishmen. But yeah, it's interesting that you were saying about that first World Cup in 1987 and South Africa being banned from it, because the final, New Zealand, it was probably the most dominant performance in a World Cup final that we've seen. A lot World Cup finals in rugby tend to be very cagey. Um, Exemplified best by 2011 when it was a really good tournament in New Zealand. But the final, New Zealand 8, France 7.
Mm.
I remember watching that and I was just like, this is just dire. It was just a game of box kicking and tactical muddiness and just penalties and scrums, and it was just everything that rugby at its worst can be sometimes, where you're just like desperate for someone to take someone on and or a big tackle to happen or some fast like play. But it was just a real muddy affair. It was such a boring final, but New Zealand ended up winning it. But yeah, I think if we go back to that first World Cup in '87, that would have been such an entertaining final. If we'd have known South Africa, New Zealand at that time in Auckland, New Zealand, at the backdrop of everything that had happened. Um, because they played France in that final. It actually ended up being France, and they dominated it, won 29-9. So I think it would have been a much closer run affair if South Africa were allowed to compete in that competition. But maybe the fact that they were banned from those first two is what spurred them on to be so great since then, since they were allowed back into the competition. And obviously, the wins that they've had, two consecutive ones recently, 2019, 2023, and 2007. Since the turn of the 2000s, they've kind of been the team that turns up at the Rugby World Cups. New
Mm.
Zealand, you can see sometimes the pressure gets to them a little bit. Um,
They don't
whereas,
quite have Richie McCaw and Dan Carter to fall back
yeah,
on now.
yeah, they don't have those players to pull them through those
Yeah.
massive fixtures. Whereas South Africa, like you touched upon before, Brent, they have that tactical
Mm.
nous that wins them games in massive tournaments, and why they've been so dominant recently, because
Well,
they're just brilliant tactically rather than the kind of individual brilliance that New Zealand have brought to rugby.
well, it's interesting you say that because when I was going back and looking historically at the South Africans in terms of the tactics they brought in the amateur era, a lot of newspaper clippings and a lot of articles were saying, oh, the British, the French, and the other Celtic nations were very annoyed at the box kicking, at the slowing down of play of the South Africans. It seems that for nearly 100 years they have been at the same tactics and they have found the same success. How
Yeah.
come New Zealand and other nations can't seem to deal with it? Like,
Yeah, it's one of rugby's great myths is that this kind they're not new to the dark arts, are they? South
Mm.
Africa, they've been doing it a long time, but the dark arts, especially at the moment, they seem to be bettering the individual brilliance of these other nations. So you think about the great teams that New Zealand have had since the 2000s and the great players that they've had. But yeah, South Africa and their wily ways of winning penalties and box kicking and playing through the forwards and making the
Battering
game,
you in the scrum.
yeah, battering you in the scrum, winning
Yeah.
penalties at the scrum. That
Yeah.
seems to be their niche, and it's what they do so brilliantly. And no one is finding an answer to it. Hopefully, someone will soon, and will stop the tyranny of Faf de Klerk.
It's
well,
interesting though, because like so much of South Africa's identity is currently is the bomb squad.
Yeah.
And okay, we've got 12 forwards that are just going to absolutely batter you for 80 minutes. What are you going to do about that? And we saw with
Yeah.
England in the World Cup, it was like, well, now we're going to have to bring on a prop who can't scrummage to save his life.
Mm,
Um, and that's what they do. And the dark arts are what they're best at.
mhm.
I do think it's really interesting though, because I would say both teams historically are really good at those dark arts. Like I don't
Yeah.
think I ever saw Richie McCaw lie on the correct side of a ruck. He was
Yeah.
always on the wrong side. Um, but I would say New Zealand are so much more adept at playing free-flowing, nice attacking rugby, whereas
Mm,
South Africa is very, we're gonna muddy this game. We're gonna
yeah.
make it horrible and nasty, and we're gonna win that way. And I think it's so interesting to have two teams that have two very opposed styles of rugby.
Mm,
well, can I ask both of you, and I'd love to get your opinions on this, of geographically, New Zealand and South Africa aren't the closest nation to each other to play against each other. There's
Mm.
a big country in the middle of a few
mm,
kangaroos hopping about that that might kind of want to be the rivals for both teams,
mm.
but they aren't considered. Why is Australia not? and I don't want to say respected, but why are they not respected? They've won two World Cups. Why are they
Mm.
not respected as much as New Zealand is to South Africa or South Africa is to New Zealand?
Yeah, I think you you look at Australia and they've got such a patchy history of rugby, whereas South Africa and New Zealand have been consistently at the top. They don't really let up. There's not really been periods where they've faded into obscurity. But I think of Australia recently in the past 10 years, and they've really flattered to deceive. I think it's in quite a tricky place, Australian rugby at the moment. I'm not done too much reading on why that is, but they're just not getting the results. The performances are quite poor. You see them at World Cups and they don't look up for it. They don't look like they're taking the same pride in playing for their nation as many other countries. Like you see Fiji, Argentina, Scotland, those second tier nations now have a real fire under them to go and get
Mm.
results. But Australia, yeah, just don't seem to be quite at the races, and I think that's happened a few times throughout the history of rugby, which is why they're not taken seriously by New Zealand and South Africa as serious challengers to them.
I was just going to,
But for
before
me, it's
we're,
because they've got three different brands of rugby all going on,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
Union is the smallest one out of those. I would say internally, I mean, from my point of view, it's league is the biggest one. They really
yeah.
love rugby league. They care about it much more than they do union. And obviously, you've got the AFL as well, which,
Hmm.
they're the only country that plays it, but they, still love it.
Yeah,
Um, so I think it's probably a little bit of that. And like you say, just the inconsistency from World Cup to World Cup. You never know which
yeah,
Australia is going to
yeah.
turn up.
100%. Yeah, I think if they managed to imagine the talent pool that they would have if they could
Ah,
bring all three of those sports together,
I know.
Australia would be at the top with New Zealand and South
Absolutely.
Africa, no doubt. If they could kind of bring those players all into
Mm,
one pool of talent, it would be
mm,
unbelievable. But
mm.
as we've seen in English rugby, the transition from league to union, sometimes you get a Jason Robinson and sometimes you get a Sam Burgess. Like
He was hard done by.
I did not like Sam Burgess's stint in rugby union. I was like, get this guy out of the squad. He just looked so out of his depth. But then Jason Robinson, the greatest winger that the Northwest has ever produced. So Sale's finest.
Oh, hang on. I think Dean Ashton has something to say about that. Is
Yeah,
it Dean Ashton? Yeah,
Chris
yeah. He
Ashton.
played. He played Chris Ashton. He played league for Wigan, I think, didn't he as well?
Yeah, yeah, he played
Yeah,
there. He's from Wigan. Yeah,
yeah.
Chris Ashton versus Jason Robinson, two very different kind of wingers. But we're
Mm.
getting sidetracked here.
That's the next
this,
rivalry we'll cover.
Yeah, yeah,
but no, the only reason I bring that question up was because Australia won two of the first four World Cups in the rugby. So I was just curious
mm,
of why they weren't ever considered. Because historically, like, yes, South Africa and New Zealand, but you would have thought Australia would have been in there with all the titles that they would have been
yeah,
fighting
yeah.
for as well.
Mm.
Yeah, they were
Um,
very close to winning two more as well. Like there was that one, obviously 2003 when England
Mm.
finally won it. They were very close to winning that, and then they also got to the final. When did they last get to the final?
2015.
2015, yeah, against New Zealand. Probably just against a great New Zealand side at that
Mm.
point in time. Um, but yeah, they if things had turned out differently, if they'd had off days, Australia quite easily have been the side that have won four World Cups. But
Well,
not to
Elliot,
be.
I'm going to take a kind of point you made. I'm going to throw it over to Joe, which was Elliot talked about how imperious New Zealand were for the whole history, but how in the modern era and professional era, teams have seemed to have caught up. Like you look at New Zealand's performance now in, as Elliot kindly put it, the B Tech version of the Nations League or the African Cup of Nations in the Championship, where they're currently sitting third. I believe they're sitting
Mm.
third um, in the Championship after losing to South Africa twice and losing to
Mm.
Argentina.
Mm.
Um, Argentina and South Africa are vying for the title. New Zealand might be on the off chance, but they'd need a draw between the two teams to win it
Mm.
at time of
Mm.
recording. But how has teams like Ireland and England and France all caught up to New Zealand, but they still seem to suffer at the hands of South Africa?
weirdly, I think because countries are a lot more open to hiring outside of their nation, it has sort of spread that wealth of knowledge. England have had coaches from other nations, so have Ireland, and I think bringing those rugby principles from other countries does sort of not accelerate, but it perhaps changes the way that rugby's played, and the players that are brought through. So I think that's how teams like Ireland, like I know we all joke, but Ireland were dominant in the 2010s, like one of the best rugby nations, in my opinion. So
To
I think
watch,
that
definitely to
yeah, yeah, I think
watch.
that
Brilliant to
growth of
watch, but then didn't ever win much. So
Three, three Grand Slams, will take that.
but I think that's what's happened. I think teams have caught up because um they've decided we need to hire outside of our traditional talent pool and we need to look elsewhere at new ideas and really look at how rugby's played and what's the best way to optimize our players, our people, our nation's type of player.
And Elliot, do you want to add on that, or?
Yeah, yeah, I think this is something that I put down for, the point when we're going to talk about where we see the future of the rivalry going. In general, I think you see the future of this gap between those second tier nations and the big two, South Africa and New Zealand, is closing. There's been a
Mm,
positive trend of results where more teams are upsetting the odds and are getting results against South Africa and New Zealand in particular have had a couple of results where they've been on the road and they've really been quite shaky. I remember one in particular where they came to Twickenham and England battered
mm,
them, and that was when New Zealand were really, really good. It was funny because if we talk about Chris Ashton, he was in that side then, and it was
mm.
it was Manu Tuilagi. And yeah, there's been a trend, a growing trend of teams getting results against these behemoths, and I think it's something to keep an eye on because I think it's going to continue in that way.
It's funny though that you mentioned that because I think Southern Hemisphere teams don't necessarily travel to Europe well, apart from
No,
South Africa because they're on the same time zone.
yeah, yeah, time zone. And I think climate is a big thing
Mm,
as well. It's very different for them. And yeah,
mm,
the, I know they have adjustment periods where they have a couple of weeks in a training
mm.
camp before they then start playing games. But
It's
yeah,
different.
yeah, it's different.
Maybe the thing is as Joe kind of rightly said, which was the outside influences. Do you think
Mm,
the URC having three, four South African teams now in it is helping a lot of Celtic nations come up against teams that play the same way, experience the same tactics, maybe adopt the tactics? Where you've also got them playing in the Champions Cup, so French sides are playing against them, and the
mm.
English sides are playing against them, and they're
Mm.
all getting to experience more regularly going to South Africa, and maybe they get to play against New Zealand with tactics that New Zealand don't particularly like,
Mm.
where it's
I think there's a
bringing it
bit of that.
across.
I think there's a bit of that. I think it's not like football. Football is a very, well, I mean, our perception of football is a very European centric. I think rugby is a global game. You have great teams in Europe, you have great teams in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think the more that you can get those teams together to play, the better the game will be for everybody because um, you get that exposure to watching maybe the best team from New Zealand or South Africa versus the best team from Europe. And I think that's only positive for the game, definitely.
Yeah, I think when it comes to club rugby, there's definitely there'd be massive perks to having more of those
Mm,
ties where you have the Southern Hemisphere clubs playing the European clubs. But a massive complaint at the moment is that those Southern Hemisphere clubs that are playing in the European competitions don't put their best side out. They treat it as a chance to bed in some youngsters or get the old guys a bit of a run round. They're not playing the guys that are at the peak because they don't want them to get injured. Because it's the competitions that they're involved in in their actual home country. Why would you care? Like it's kind of the same argument as like in football when City go to play the Club World Cup or Barcelona or any of the teams when they play the Club World Cup, they don't take it as serious because they don't want the players to get injured for the actual tournaments. So
Yeah.
there's a
It's like the rugby league when St. Helens or Wigan play against, Melbourne Victory or
yeah,
whatever. And Melbourne Victory are just like, oh, we'll just put the kids out. And then St.
yeah,
Helens and Wigan are fighting tooth and nail to
yeah,
try and get us
yeah, exactly.
a result. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'll move on in terms of that, and we'll go back to the rivalry. And I'll kind of touch on what you said of the future. How do we see the
Mm,
future going? Now, I've got a couple of questions in regards to this, which is, do we see it intensifying? Do we see a possible issue with, I think the contract for the 2027 Six Nations is due for renewal, or there's a
Mm.
renewal process coming up for 2028. And there is a lot of rumors now. This might piss off a lot of Jordans who listen to this, where an expansion of the Six Nations
Mm.
might become the Seven
mm,
Nations, where they bring in South Africa, whereas Georgia has been knocking on the door for a good
yeah.
10, 15 years. But yet, but that would end up taking South Africa out of the championship and putting them in
Mm.
the Six Nations, taking
Mm.
away that rivalry where they play against each other. Is that good? Is it bad? Or should we keep things the same? Or what should we do for the future of the rivalry and for the future of international rugby?
Yeah, I think for the improvement of international rugby going around, I think obviously at the moment, like I said, you see those second tier nations, Georgia, Japan, teams like that are having a real rise, and they're taking rugby seriously. And there's a lot of real talented players. Fiji as well at the last
Mm.
World Cup were incredible to watch. Should have beat England, in my opinion, in
They
that game
started
where they
doing the
played.
things that like win rugby games, and it's never
Yeah,
been done by
yeah, yeah,
Fiji
yeah,
inside.
yeah. Fiji have just been like fun to watch as like a flair team, but now they're having that kind of South African
Yeah.
influence of knowing actually we can't just win a game by trying to offload every pass and play almost what's it called, the basketball team who do the
Oh, the
fancy
Globetrotters.
globetrotters of rugby. They've kind of moved away from that and started playing more tactically. So in terms of the rivalry between South Africa and New Zealand, I still hope they play each other on a regular basis. But I do I do think we're not far away from another World Cup final that includes neither of these sides. I think we're the last time that happened was 2003, when it was England Australia. Since then, every World Cup final has had either South Africa or New Zealand in it. So we're not far away from going to that again, because the improvement you see in Ireland, in France, in England, and teams like that, there has been a narrowing of the gap. And I know when it comes to the big tournaments, there still might, the old the old big two might still come to the front. But yeah, I think everyone loves to see as many South African New Zealand games as possible because the glamour tie. But like I said, I don't think um, we'll be seeing it as often as a massive fixture, because of the improvement of other sides, which is fair enough.
Okay, Joe?
Um, I think I it's hard to say that that fact really surprised me of um so many finals, but including either South Africa or New Zealand. I didn't realize that.
Mm,
Um, they are so dominant, both of them. And you're right, it is a glamour tie. But I think we all enjoy the idea of South Africa versus New Zealand. But when it comes to actually watching it, sometimes it can be a
yeah,
miserable game of rugby.
yeah,
Um, I think I hope they don't move them into the Six Nations because I would hope that the rivalry stays alive for the right reasons, which is, they're both two competitive rugby sides that are at the top of the game. And I think emphasis should be put on those second tier nations more than it should be on
mhm,
improving the matchup of you know your England, France, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. I think the way the game is going to grow is in Pacific Islands or in Japan or in Georgia. Portugal,
mm.
and other South American nations had quite decent showings at the
Yeah,
World Cup.
Uruguay, quite fun to watch
I
as
know they
well.
got battered by the traditional, big five, but they still had a good showing, and I think that's great for the sport. So I
Yeah,
think instead of taking South Africa out of the Quad Nations, they should be adding more countries to the Quad Nations and to the Six Nations, but not
Yeah,
necessarily South Africa to the
I agree.
Six Nations.
Yeah. As a
Well,
side point to that, I just want to say that I think it would be kind of typical that as Scotland and Italy have started getting some positive results in the Six Nations, especially in the last one. Scotland obviously got a good record
Mm,
against England in the last couple of years. Italy have had more than their fair share of upsets and some
mm.
brilliant players coming through the Italian system now. It'd be typical then for them to throw South Africa in the mix. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's kind of it's not really fair when you're starting to see the results of all the hard work that Italy and Scotland have been putting in to then throw them into to throw South Africa into it. It'd be a bit unfair. So I agree with Joe that expand the Six Nations to have include sides like Georgia and Portugal because it will grow. The more top nations that they play, the more experience they're going to have going to the World Cups, and the
Mm,
more interesting the World Cup's going to be. And then the same over in in the Tri Nations tournament as it was now the Quad. Get Japan in there, get
mm,
Uruguay involved. If Argentina can be involved, so can
mm,
Uruguay. Get Fiji and the Pacific Islands involved in those tournaments and have almost like a European championship
mm.
and a Southern Hemisphere kind of all-encompassing championship that are two proper trophies that can then kind of take us through those transitional periods between World Cups.
It's almost
well,
like a Nations League.
Yeah,
Joe. It's funny. It's funny you mention that because they actually have made the plan to introduce that.
Have they?
The
Okay.
plan
I like
is
that.
the plan is you got a top 10 or a top 12, and they're getting rid of November and summer and spring series. So what you got is a league format over 2 years.
Mm,
The first two league iterations, so that'll be 4 years. Um, there's no relegation, so you have the top teams, and then you got the second tier teams. I hope they put third tier nations in their own
yeah,
yeah,
little league, so that you can
yeah,
get promoted, relegated, and you can start
yeah,
developing the
yeah.
nations of at the level. So I think that's a positive for World Rugby. The only consideration I have, and I know footballers are talking about going on strike because there's too much football. I do think I do think that rugby players are different because of the hits they take and
Mm.
the strain on their bodies of
yeah.
Head
high
injuries
level
as
internet.
well.
Pardon?
Mm,
Head injuries as well.
Yeah. But
mm,
this is what I'm saying. I think there needs to be precaution taken regarding this tournament. And I think it's why they're taking out the November series and all this. But you need to start thinking, right, safety of the players
Mm.
over financial gain or international improvement. There needs to be a balancing of this. And for those smaller nations, you'll see Uruguay or Portugal with their better players being forced to play big games continuously
Mm.
against
mm,
nations they try and improve. So just I think there's a wee bit of caution needs to be taken with it, but I think it's a
yeah,
good idea as a whole.
I think just for the future of rugby in general, I think they need to get rid of scrums. I think I know they'll receive a lot of pushback on that, but I genuinely think the way that a better way to do it would be to like just kick and go. Just make the game faster. Don't slow it down and bring us all into like a scrum. Just tap it and go. I think that would be personally for me. I think that would be something more pleasant to watch. I know there's the tradition, the history, and the scrums, and it's hard for me to say that as a former forward. But I just think rugby needs to speed up a little bit. That's one of my main complaints is sometimes it can get right bogged down and stodgy.
mm,
It's a tough one, that one,
Mm.
because you talk about tradition, all this, like the hits they take in the running at
Mm.
each other as well. It's just not even just in the scrum, just the hits they take, like the
Yeah,
continuous hit after hit. You'd be then talking about changing the sport as a whole to an extent.
yeah, I understand
Um,
that, but I just think if you're looking at player safety, I think that's one of the main places to start for me. You obviously don't want it to eliminate certain types of players from the game, but I
yeah.
don't know.
That was the thing that popped into my head. Then was like rugby's great because it's so accessible because you've
Mm,
got everyone could play a rugby position, whether you're a smaller, nippier guy like you, Brendan, or whether you're a big burly guy like myself or Joe, rugby is kind of fitting to both of them. So if you take scrums out of the game, you're not getting you're not getting your Dan Coles and
Mm.
your Ellis Genges and your Furlongs and all them. They're not going to be interested in rugby anymore because scrummaging is their wheelhouse.
Yeah, yeah,
It is
I
what they want to
suppose.
do. So, but at the same time, do you also want to be, taking the risk of having potentially lasting brain
Neck
injuries
injuries, yeah,
and
brain
neck
injuries.
injuries? So,
So,
yeah, it's a real double-edged sword that I'm sure in our lifetimes there will be some kind of advancement.
so just to move back to South Africa, New Zealand, just so we can summarize.
Yeah,
Mm.
Going to ask you a quick wee question, and I kind of want a small answer. So, Joe, South Africa and New Zealand, who do you prefer? Why?
Even though I've spent the last hour and a bit talking about South Africa, New Zealand every time, just it's so they are the it team in rugby. They're the team that I remember, first being interested in, the hacker, the players that they had. They're just incredible, incredible team.
And Elliot?
yeah, same here, same here. Very similar things. I mean, it doesn't help that South Africa have such, for us have such a associated heartache from losing
Mm.
two finals and a semi-final in the last 10 years. But in the same way, I do respect South Africa a lot for how they play rugby and their kind of the interesting things that they're doing, especially when I I played it for a little bit longer than Joe has, so you come to appreciate the dark arts and being able to
Mm.
do that more when you play the game. So yeah, I have an appreciation for South Africa, but All Blacks are just they're so cool.
How
Well,
about you,
look,
Brem?
for me, it has to be South Africa, honestly.
Really? Oh.
Because
Yeah.
they've beaten England so many times. That's why. Because he has no one
Um,
else to hope for. When Ireland get knocked out of the competition, he goes, "Oh well, at least South Africa will beat England."
no, honestly, I think it comes from like, I remember I got given a South African top when I was younger,
Mm.
and I kind of had no kind of understanding of it, and all this kind of thing. But I then kind of got into it, and look, as I say, my first World Cup was 2007, seeing them win. Even then, I didn't like them. I didn't like New Zealand because I just thought they were bully boys. Um, and Ireland have had a good history over South Africa, to be honest.
Mm.
Mm.
New Zealand not so much. But I've always just had a respect for South Africa, and maybe it helps the fact that, and I've interviewed a few South African players. Rugby means the world to them. It really
Mm.
Mm.
does. And having sat down and talked to them, it was such an enlightening experience
Mm.
in terms of seeing a bunch of meetings. I've talked to a few New Zealanders, and the funny thing is they're so nonchalant about it. Just like, yeah,
Mm.
life's good. I'm playing rugby. I'm enjoying it. Whereas
Mm.
rugby is the world for South Africa, and that's probably why I have a wee bit of a thing for them and more of, look, it means so much more, so much more.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, look, I'm going to summarize and now finish up and say thank you everyone for listening, and Joe, Elliot, thank you for coming on board and having a chat. I look to see you soon.
No
Yeah, thanks,
worries. Hope to
Bren.
see you soon, Brem. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.